Thank you for joining us today. My name is Tessa Fields. I'm the Manager of Clinical Outreach here at Edimer Pharmaceuticals. And I'd like to introduce you to Carrie Milliard. Carrie will be leading our webinar today, and she is a genetic counselor who has been working with families affected by XLHED for the past 3 years. Some of you may be familiar with her name, and if you've seen it on the XLHED network or the Have the Conversation website. She's a great resource available to any of you at any time to discuss XLHED or any questions you might have about the genetics of XLHED. Additionally, she runs the XLHED Global GeneScreen Program, which is a program offering free genetic testing for those families who are affected by XLHED and may qualify, which you'll hear more about later this afternoon. So I want to thank Carrie not only for her time, but her continued support for families affected by XLHED. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it on over to her.
Thanks, Tessa. And thank you all for joining us today for our webinar series. And today we're going to talk about the genetics of XLHED. As Tessa said, I'm a genetic counselor working with Edimer Pharmaceuticals for the past 3 years. And before we get started with the actual genetics, I just want you to meet the rest of the Edimer team. So you can see that all the team here, many of these faces may be familiar to you if you are active in the XLHED network or have gone to the family conferences. So now that you know the team, let's dive right into the genetics. So I'm going to start with Genetics 101, so the basics. And I hope after today's webinar that you have a better understanding of basic genetics and the genetics of XLHED, how genetic testing works, why it is important to have genetic testing, and how you may be able to get genetic testing clinically or through our Global GeneScreen program. So we're going to start with the very basics. So genetics is the study of how traits are passed on from parent to offspring. So traits are the physical characteristics of a person, such as height, eye color, hair color, all the things that make up how your body looks and functions. And now, I can't get through a talk on genetics without showing off the results of the genes that I recently passed on. This is my son, Lucas, who's 7 months old. And everyone tells me he looks just like his dad and nothing like me, but all of his expressions come from me. And so you can see that I probably look pretty goofy most of the time. And I'm just desperately hoping that he doesn't inherit the fantasy football gene from my husband. You see him there cheering on the Patriots here in New England. So before we get into inheritance and how things are passed along, I just want to take a moment to go over these genetic terms so that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. And so DNA is the blueprint of the cell. It gives the instructions to the cells on what their jobs will be in the body. And it's made of a special code which gives all the information for building and maintaining an organism. And this is similar to the way in which letters of an alphabet appear in a certain order to form words and sentences. So the DNA has this code, like words and sentences, that tell the body how to function. Now, genes are made up of the DNA, and each gene contains a set of instructions to make a particular protein in the cell. And so you may have a number of proteins that make the cell run. So the proteins are the machines that make living things function. You can think of these like the parts of an engine in a car. Each protein has a different job, and they all work together to make the cell run properly. So if the proteins in the cell aren't correct, then that cell cannot function as it's supposed to. Just like if a spark plug was missing from the engine of a car, it wouldn't run without that piece. So the chromosomes are the storage unit of genes, and a little bit later we'll take a look at what human chromosomes look like. And lastly, the genome is the whole collection of genetic information. And so now that we know the terms, let's take a look at what this really looks like within our cells. So you can see here how this all fits together. Your body, everyone's body, is made up of trillions of cells. And the different cells of the body have unique jobs depending on where they are. And you can see here heart cells, brain cells, skin cells, fat cells. they all work and look very different, though they all contain the same genetic material. So in order for these cells to work differently, they need a different set of instructions, and the instructions they get from the genes that make the protein. So you might be thinking, if all the genetic material in every cell is the same, how do we get such a variety of different cells? And as I alluded to in the last slide, it's the genes that determine how a cell functions and what specific activities will go on in that cell. So in a bone cell, the genes that are active make a different combination of proteins than in a pancreas cell or a brain cell. So while all the cells have the same genetic material, different genes are turned on and off, which makes each cell type unique and helps our body to have a variety of different functions within the cell. So we've now seen the cartoons of all our genetic material. Let's take a look at what the real thing looks like. So in each cell of our body contains our whole set of chromosomes. So this is the human chromosomes out of one cell of the body. We call this picture a karyotype. And as you can see, our cells contain two sets of chromosomes. One of these sets is inherited from the mother, and one is inherited from our father. And so the egg contains half of the genetic material that we get, and the sperm of the father carries the other half for a total of 46 chromosomes. You can see that the first 22 pairs look very similar within each pair, and these are called the autosomes. And so you've gotten one of the pair from your mother and one from your father with a variety of different genes on each chromosome. And then the last set you'll see in this picture are labeled as X and Y. And so these are the pairs that we call the sex chromosomes, and they determine the gender of an individual. So females will inherit two X chromosomes, one X from their mother and one X from their father, and males get an X from their mother and a Y from their father. And you can see that this particular karyotype is that of a male because we have, on that last set of chromosomes, we have an X and a Y. So you can see the Y chromosome right here. Okay, and so it's this unique set of genetic material that we inherit that makes us all look differently, function differently. And let's talk a little bit more about how our genetic material influences our traits and what you see. So the collection of genetic material that you possess in your body, we call a genotype. And you're going to hear me use the term genotype throughout this talk when we're talking about genetic testing. So I will use that term quite frequently to talk about your set of genetic material, or if somebody has a genetic mutation that's part of their genotype. So this is inherited from your parents, and the genes that you inherit influence your traits. And so what we see on the outside is called a phenotype. And so your genotype determines your phenotype, so what people can see when they look at you: brown hair, your height, all the traits that we talked about earlier. So when people have XLHED, a mutation in the gene causes a phenotype that can include abnormal sweating, missing teeth, sparse hair. So that's how the genotype and phenotype interact. So before we move on to talk specifically about the genetics of XLHED, I just want to do a quick review of gene mutations. So simply put, gene mutations are permanent changes in the DNA sequence. As we talked about earlier, the DNA code is similar to the way in which letters of the alphabet appear in a certain order to form words and sentences. So you can see in this diagram the letters of the alphabet being put on these are DNA structures. And so if there's a typo in the sentence, it can change the whole meaning of a sentence. And the same is true with the DNA code in your body. If there's a change in the code, the wrong proteins could be made, no proteins could be made at all, extra proteins could be made, And this will cause the cell to function differently than it normally would. And so you can see in this diagram that the A has changed to a C, which could change the function in that cell. So there are two ways that gene mutations can occur. They can be inherited from your parents, which is often the case with XLHED. Sometimes new mutations can also occur in genetic diseases, but with most cases of XLHED, you inherit that gene mutation from your parent. In a few minutes, we'll talk a little bit more about how that gene mutation is passed on from parent to child. There are also gene mutations that can be acquired. An example of this would be a type of mutation that would occur from UV damage from the sun, which may cause a skin cancer. So that's an acquired type of mutation. So these two examples make it seem like all gene mutations cause health problems, but in reality, every person has gene mutations, and they may not affect us at all, or they may even be beneficial. It just depends on how the typo in the DNA affects the proteins that are made. And so there could be a change that doesn't really affect the sentence, and we still can get the meaning, and it doesn't affect how the cells function. So to review, our bodies are made up of millions of cells, and those cells house all of our genetic material. Even though they all have the same genetic material, different genes are turned on to tell each cell how to function. Those genes are housed in 23 sets of chromosomes, with the last pair being the sex chromosomes that determine our gender. Any changes that we have in our genes can be called mutations. Everybody in the world has genetic mutations, and not all mutations are detrimental. Some can have no effect at all, and others can be beneficial. So now that we have the basics of genetics down, let's move on to talking about XLHED specifically. So we're back to our karyotype again, which is our set of chromosomes in every cell. And on this diagram, you can see the gene involved in XLHED, the EDA gene. And it's located on the X chromosome, one of the sex chromosomes, which is why we call this condition X-linked, because the gene that is mutated when someone has XLHED is carried on the X chromosome. Now, there are many other types of ectodermal dysplasias, and those may be caused by mutations on the first 22 set of chromosomes called the autosomes. And these may present with similar symptoms to XLHED, but the way they're passed on in a family is very different, which we will talk about why that information is important a little bit later. Now, when we're talking about inheritance, I'm going to focus solely on how the inheritance works in X-linked conditions, since that's what's relevant to us talking about XLHED. So conditions that are inherited in an X-linked fashion, like XLHED, all have some common characteristics. So in general, males are more severely affected than females. So as we talked about earlier, females have 2 copies of the X chromosome in their cells. And so when the mutation occurs on one of the X chromosomes and it isn't making the right proteins for the cell to function, women have the advantage that they have a second X chromosome that can help out by producing some proteins so that the cell can function perhaps a little more typically than in the males who don't have a second X chromosome. So since the males only have one X chromosome, there's no way that they can make enough of the needed protein to make their cells run properly. And so in XLHED, a variety of cells are affected by this lack of protein, including the skin, hair, teeth, sweating glands, and respiratory system. So another characteristic of X-linked conditions is there is no male-to-male transmission. As we talked about, a father will pass on his Y chromosome to all his male children, and therefore they don't receive that X that has the mutation in the EDA gene. The X chromosome that they pass on that has the mutation will go to all their daughters, however. So if a male is affected with XLHED, he will pass on that gene mutation to all of his daughters, who will be carriers, who may be have a variety of symptoms. They may show no symptoms at all, or they may be, have even a little bit less symptoms than men, but you don't know because the phenotype can vary for women. You see this diagram on the bottom of the slide. This is what in the genetics world we call a pedigree, and it's a graphic representation of the inheritance within a family. So if you're to meet with a genetic counselor or a geneticist to talk about your family history, they'll often draw a picture like this just to tease out how a condition is being passed on within a family and to really see the history. Pedigrees are very useful to show how a condition is passed on and helps us determine what genetic testing might be the best option for a family. And you can see the women with the dot in the middle. Those are carrier females who have one of their X's with a mutation. And you can see how that's passed along in the family. So mothers with a mutation on the X chromosome have a 50% chance of having an affected son. And before we talk specifically about genetic testing, let's take a closer look at the inheritance of XLHED. So you can see here a diagram of a family, and it's showing how XLHED is passed on when a father is affected. So you can see, as we said in the last slide, that the father passes on his X chromosome that has the mutation to all of his daughters, but all of his sons will be unaffected. In this second diagram, you see a mother who is a carrier for XLHED. So she's going to pass on, she has a 1 in 4 chance of having an affected son and a 1 in 4 chance of having a carrier daughter. And as we had just talked about, women with XLHED can have a variety of symptoms that range from mild to severe, and there's no way to predict that phenotype. So to review, the gene mutation for XLHED is on the X chromosome, and it's called the EDA gene. Women have milder symptoms of XLHED because they have 2 X chromosomes, which can compensate and make protein for the cell to function a little more typically. As you saw, X-linked conditions have some unique characteristics, and women who have mutations in EDA have a chance of having a son or daughter with XLHED. But men who have mutations in EDA can only pass it on to their daughters, and their sons will be unaffected. So we've gone through a lot of genetics right now, and so I want to stop just for a second and see if any questions have come in about anything we've talked about so far. And if not, we'll keep going, but I just will pause here for a moment.
It doesn't look like we've had any questions come in over the chat, so why don't we keep going and we can touch base at the end.
Great. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to spend a very brief amount of time talking about genetic testing. Now, this is going to be a very simplified version because there are lots of genetic tests out there with lots of different technologies, which they're not all relevant to us today. So I'm just going to go over how we look for basic changes in genetic information, and then we'll move on to talking about genetic testing in more detail specific to XLHED. So how do we detect missing or extra chromosomes? So we want to find out if a whole chromosome is missing or a large chunk of a chromosome is missing. In this slide, you see a set of 46 encyclopedia books. So our chromosomes can be seen as like a set of 46 encyclopedia books, and a chromosome analysis is available to determine if there are any missing or extra books. And so this type of chromosome analysis gives us the picture that we have referred to as the karyotype. And you can see in this karyotype it looks a little bit different from the one we were looking at earlier because there are missing chromosomes. So you see that this spot is missing on this diagram. So that's how we can determine if whole pieces of chromosomes are missing. Now, there's also technology available to detect missing or extra pieces of chromosomes. So as we talked about earlier, our genes are like sentences on each page of this set of encyclopedias, which are our chromosomes. So each page of a book contains a unique set of sentences, and those are our genes. So each page contains sentences for approximately 10 to 30 genes, and a technology called a DNA microarray analysis is available to open up each of the 46 encyclopedia books and determine if there are any missing or extra pages. So this takes a look at, a little bit smaller change in the gene to see if there's any missing or extra pieces on the chromosome that may not be apparent when we just look at the karyotype. So now if we wanted to detect small changes in a particular gene, we'd use a technique called sequencing. And this is the technique we use when we're looking for changes in the EDA gene. So like we talked about earlier, our DNA are like letters that make up each sentence on each page of these books. So each sentence is made up of a very specific sequence of letters, which is the DNA. Now, genetic sequencing is able to read a specific sentence to determine if there are any spelling mistakes or genetic mutations. So this is how we would look for changes in the EDA gene. So in brief review, we can look for changes in chromosomes and genes in many ways, and we use sequencing technology to look for mutations in the EDA gene. So once we detect the mutation in your family, it makes it a little bit easier to determine if that mutation is in other family members, because we can just look for that one gene change or typo, and we don't have to sequence the whole gene or look at every sentence on the page to find that typo. So why is genetic testing important for families with a clinical diagnosis of XLHED? So as you probably realize, if you've been clinically diagnosed with XLHED, genetic testing may not necessarily change your own medical management of the condition. You already know how to manage your medical issues and what precautions to take. But let's talk about why it may be important to family planning. So as we talked about earlier, there are a number of different types of ectodermal dysplasias that may have similar symptoms to XLHED, but very different inheritance patterns. Knowing whether the type of HED in your family is X-linked or autosomal on one of the first 22 sets of chromosomes allows us to accurately determine the risk of passing a gene mutation on to your children. With XLHED, we know that males are more severely affected than females, but with other types of HED, both genders can be equally affected. And so it's important to make this distinction of where the gene mutation is occurring so we can accurately relay the likelihood that your child could have symptoms of HED or XLHED. So once you know your risk of passing on a gene mutation, then you have the power to decide if testing your baby for XLHED either during or after pregnancy will be helpful to your family. Everyone on this call knows the dangerous medical issues that can come with XLHED. And some people will want to know in advance if their baby is at risk for these issues, because it can help you plan for labor, delivery, and the newborn period. It may affect your choice of hospital or birthing center. It can help you prepare your OB and care team for the baby's arrival by educating them about XLHED and things they might want to consider and be cautious about, like overbundling a newborn or turning up the heat in the delivery room. So knowing your baby's XLHED status before or after delivery may help some families mentally prepare for the medical and emotional challenges that can come up early in life. So how do you find out what testing options are available and decide what works best for your family? There's a lot of information out there. How do you work on deciphering what works for your family? I may be a little biased, but I think one of the best ways to learn about testing options is talking with a genetic professional. I know one common preconceived notion about genetic counselors is that we exist to eliminate genetic conditions and how you might manage a pregnancy affected by these conditions. But I hope today I can shed some light on the many different roles of a genetic counselor and why talking to one might be beneficial for families with a history of XLHED. First of all, I see genetic counselors as teachers. They're there to explain basic genetics like we've talked about today, inheritance of conditions, and the significance of your own family history. Based on the information they gather about your family history, they also can help describe the available genetic testing options and the risks of testing. And we know that getting all this information at once in a genetic counseling session can be very overwhelming. So genetic counselors are equipped to help families talk through the testing options, weigh the pros and cons of testing, and decide what really works best for your family and your style. And genetic counselors aren't there to tell you what decisions to make, but rather to facilitate your decision-making process and provide you with emotional support while making decisions about testing and managing your pregnancy. Now, everyone on this call has a unique experience with XLHED. You might have the condition yourself. You may have a child, a sibling, a distant relative, a patient with XLHED. And those individual experiences will influence your decisions around family planning and deciding on testing options. Now, I can't tailor this talk to everybody's individual needs, so I just want to briefly touch on some of the testing options that are out there so you have ideas of what might be of interest to you when you have your own genetic counseling session. As Tessa mentioned in the beginning, I'm also available once we're off this webinar to talk to anybody individually if you have questions about your family history and would like to talk more about your individual situation. So many of you with a family history of XLHED will start thinking about the inheritance and the risk of passing it on to your children before even trying to conceive. In the last slide, we covered some reasons why carrier testing might be useful, like knowing your risk of passing on XLHED and preparing for the birth of an affected child. But I've found that many families I've counseled also want to hear about the options for having a child who is not affected or a carrier of XLHED. And that discussion leads us to the topic of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or what we call PGD, which is a very specialized procedure that is used in combination with in vitro fertilization to screen embryos for specific genetic mutations. So they can take a look at the embryo before it's implanted to know whether it carries the gene mutation for XLHED. The goal of this procedure is to find unaffected embryos for implantation, which eliminates the risk of having a child affected with a particular genetic condition. So I'm not going to go into great detail about that, so I just wanted to touch on that so you know that that option exists. There are many pros and cons to doing a procedure like that, and if you are interested in hearing more, like I said, I'm happy to talk to you or help you find a genetic counselor to talk to about PGD. Now, during pregnancy, you also have the option of getting carrier testing. And as we just mentioned, if you know your gene mutation, you have the option to find out if your child has a genetic mutation as well. And so we had discussed that if we know the family mutation, it's much easier to look for that same mutation in the offspring. And so during pregnancy, there's the option of having a chorionic villus sampling called CVS or an amniocentesis. And these two procedures take cells from the baby during the pregnancy, and those cells can be tested to find out if the baby is affected with XLHED. And knowing this information can help you make important decisions about your pregnancy and delivery, as we touched on earlier. Now, some people may want to know the genetic status of their child, but are not interested in the risks that come along with having procedures done during pregnancy, because these procedures do carry risks of complications. So one way to do testing without any invasive procedures for your newborn is to have your care team take a sample of cord blood at birth. So this allows you to send blood off for genetic testing without having your newborn get a needle stick or having other invasive procedures done during the pregnancy. Once you decide what testing path is right for you, genetic counselors are there to help you decipher your results and what they mean for your family and future planning, and help you get on the path that you want to be going down for your pregnancy or with your newborn child. So knowing your genotype is very important for all these reasons, but one more reason it's important is it may be the key to accessing new therapies for XLHED. We're living in an era where more and more medicines are being given based on a person's genetic makeup. And as many of you on this call have probably already heard, if you're linked in with the XLHED network, is that there's a promising new treatment for baby boys born with XLHED. So I'm excited to report that this new treatment is being tested for people who have EDA mutations. And this is a very compelling reason to know your genotype. So I hope all of you were paying attention earlier, because I'm going to jump back to talking about the proteins that are involved in XLHED and describe very simply how the new treatment works. So ectodysplasia A1, or EDA A1, is a protein that occurs naturally in healthy people. And you can see on that first picture on the left that everything's working properly in this DNA strand, and so the EDA1 protein is being made, and the patient is unaffected, no problems with teeth, hair, or sweat. And in the middle slide, you can see that we have here an EDA gene mutation, and that mutation has caused the EDA-A1 protein to be missing. And when that protein's missing, as you all know from earlier, that we are going to have abnormal sweating, problems with the hair and the teeth that you see in people with the phenotype for XLHED. Now, what EDI-200 is a replacement protein for EDA-A1. And so you'll see over here that person still has the EDA gene mutation, but we're seeing some improvement in their symptoms because the EDA-200 is helping to replace the EDA-A1 protein. And in previous studies, we have found that in mice and dogs with XLHED, using this treatment in the newborn period has shown a marked improvement in the symptoms of XLHED. So this treatment has been very promising in animal models, but what about in humans? Let's talk about that. So, like I said, we know that XLHED can be treated successfully in the newborn period in mice and dogs. And based on that information, we are now enrolling subjects in the first study for human babies. And you can see that this is a worldwide study looking for healthy term males affected by XLHED. So this is another important reason to know your genotype, because if you know your child is at risk for XLHED, there's the option of getting a new treatment that may be very effective. Now, what we've learned from the dog and mice models are that we believe the best time for dosing this drug is in the very early days of life. And so this newborn study is dosing in the first 2 weeks of life. So the babies will receive 5 doses. And there'll be 2 cohorts, one that are getting a lower dose and one that are getting a higher dose, so that we can determine which dose is appropriate for symptom reduction. So the core study is 6 months long, and there's a long-term extension study. So another very compelling reason to know your genotype is to be able to access these treatments for your children. So in review, it's important to know your genotype because it can help you with family planning and testing options, and it's crucial to determine the risk of passing on a gene mutation to determine whether your mutation is on the X chromosome, making it XLHED, or if perhaps there's another type of HED running in your family. It can also potentially help you access new treatments, like the one that we are currently running for newborn males. Now, the phase 2 research study is being conducted globally, and treatment has been shown to potentially improve the symptoms associated with XLHED, and we've seen that improvement in animal models, and we're hoping that the same holds true in newborns. So now let's talk about how we can get genetic testing. So for those of you who are logged on from the U.S., one great way to find a genetic counselor or geneticist near you is to use this tool on the National Society of Genetic Counselors website. And as you probably picked up on, I'm a huge proponent of genetic counseling, and not just because it means job security for me. I think it's a great way to gather information about your family history and help you decide what testing options are right for you. There are genetic counselors all over the world, and as I had mentioned before, if there's not a genetic counselor in your area, or if you have specific questions about XLHED, I'm always happy to talk via phone or email to families who have questions. And so maybe you're sitting there thinking, well, what questions would I ask a genetic counselor? What might be useful to know when I'm going to the genetic counselor? So here we have some common questions that people ask during a genetic counseling session, things that you may want to talk over with your family, with your genetic counselor. And at Have the Conversation website, which is www.havetheconvo.com, you can download a discussion guide, which helps you think through the issues that may be important to you and your family when thinking about meeting with a genetic counselor or genetic test or getting genetic testing. So how will collecting family history information help? Can my partner or I pass on this XLHED to our child? What are the chances that the child will be affected? What testing is available? What clinical trials and treatment options are available? These are all things that your genetic counselor can help you to decipher. And so I would encourage everybody to visit the Have a Conversation website, where you can download the detailed guide to either talk to a genetic counselor near you, or if you want to call me and talk about genetic counseling. So one thing that comes up often when thinking about genetic testing is how it will affect your health insurance or your job security. In the past, there haven't been protections in place to help people from discrimination. So what is genetic discrimination? Genetic discrimination occurs if people are treated unfairly because of differences in their DNA. And so more and more tests are being developed to find out DNA differences that can affect our health. And these genetic tests will become a routine part of healthcare in the future. So healthcare providers, will have this information about each person's DNA in their chart, which then your insurance company can see, and therefore your job may also be able to ask for this information. So back in 2008, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA, was passed. And this was designed to prohibit, this is a federal act that was designed to prohibit the use of genetic information in health insurance and employment. And it bars employers from using individuals' genetic information when making hiring, firing, job placement, or promotion decisions. It, however, does not cover life insurance, disability insurance, and long-term care insurance. So those are things to keep in mind when thinking about genetic testing. And also just to note that before this federal law was passed, many states also have laws against genetic discrimination. And this federal law sets the minimum standard of protection that must be met in all states, but some states may even have further protections. So that's something that you would want to look into in your own individual state if you're in the United States. So another way to get genetic testing for families that qualify is to become a part of the XLHED Global GeneScreen. Now, this is a program put together by Edimer to provide free genetic testing for women who suspect they may be carriers of XLHED. And it also can provide free genetic testing for newborn boys who are up to 28 days old. And also, along with that service, can be free genetic counseling, talking to me about your genetic test result or any questions you have on your family history. You can find out if you qualify. So this is for women. You can find out if you qualify through the XLHED network or the Have a Convo website. And if you do qualify, you'll receive a welcome kit in the mail that gives you instructions on getting XLHED genetic testing and how to go about that. So that's another good reason to go out, free genetic testing. Go find out if you qualify, and let's review. So geneticists and genetic counselors in your area can help you determine if genetic testing would be something useful for your family and your family planning. You may qualify for the Global GeneScreen if you're a woman who suspects they may have a family history of XLHED. And this provides free genetic testing if you qualify. And you can sign up for the XLHED network. And if you do qualify, I'll send you a welcome packet to help guide you through the genetic testing process. I'm also available at any time for questions about genetic counseling, XLHED genetics, or our Global GeneScreen project. So the last thing I want to just go over a few resources for our families affected by XLHED. Now, we just talked about the XLHED Global GeneScreen and how to access qualifying information for that. Many of you probably are already involved in the XLHED network. By becoming a member, you can keep up to date on the latest research, clinical trials, and other information about what's going on in the XLHED community. We talked about the Have the Conversation website, which can provide you with information to think about starting a family, expanding your current family, and what discussion might be useful in talking with a genetic counselor. So you can also continue to see our webinar series. For those of you who were not on the last webinar, Dr. Huttner at Edimer had given a wonderful talk on the clinical trial. So if you need more information about that clinical trial and what we've found so far, that's a great resource to take a look at that webinar on the XLHED Network archives. You can also follow us on Twitter, become a Facebook friend, and be part of the XLHED conversation. And with that, if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Thank you, Carrie. So we'll go ahead and unmute everybody's line here now. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to speak up and say those here. If you don't have any questions and you'd just like to continue to listen, you'll notice there's a little icon next to your name on the right-hand side of the screen that looks like a microphone with a line through it. That's how you can remute yourself if you like. Otherwise, I'll stop talking here and give you all a chance to ask any of your questions. Well, Carrie, it seems, sorry, was that a question there? Carrie, it seems like once again you've done a fantastic job explaining. At the moment, it doesn't seem to be any questions that have come over the chat or here in the live question and answer session. So I do welcome you all to write down Carrie's contact information that you're currently seeing on the screen as you digest this information at home. Perhaps something might come up and we encourage you to contact her or any members of the Edimer team. And we just once again want to thank everybody for taking some time out of their day to join us on this call. We hope it was helpful and informative to you. And most especially, I'd like to thank Carrie for her continued support and time today, doing a fantastic job breaking down a very complex subject for us. So with that, thank you to everyone for joining, and we hope that you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.